Picture this, it's 27 AD. The most powerful man in the world has just abandoned Rome entirely. Emperor Tiberius, ruler of an empire stretching from Britain to Egypt, turns his back on the capital and sails to a small island off the Italian coast. He tells his advisors he needs rest. He tells the Senate he's temporarily relocating, but he never returns. For the next decade, whispers begin to spread across the Roman Empire. Whispers of unspeakable acts, whispers of depravity so shocking that even Romans, who weren't exactly prudes, recoiled in horror. What really happened on the island of Capri? Was Tiberius the monster that history remembers, or the victim of the ancient world's most successful character assassination? Stay with me, because the truth is far more complex and far more chilling than you might expect. Pause. If stories like this fascinate you, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into history's darkest corners every week, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. To understand what happened on Capri, we need to understand who Tiberius really was. And here's the first shock. He never wanted to be emperor. Imagine being groomed your entire life for a job you despise. That was Tiberius. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty, he was essentially adopted by Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and molded into his successor. But Tiberius had other plans. He wanted to be a scholar, a philosopher, maybe a general, but certainly not the man responsible for governing 60 million people. In 6 BC, Tiberius did something almost unthinkable. He abandoned his rising political career and went into self-imposed exile on the Greek island of Rhodes. For 7 years, he studied philosophy and tried to live as a private citizen. Augustus was furious. The Senate was confused. But Tiberius? For the first time in his life, Tiberius was happy. But fate, or Augustus, had other plans. When Augustus's chosen heirs died one by one, Tiberius found himself dragged back to Rome. Reluctantly, he accepted his destiny. In 14 AD, when Augustus died, Tiberius became emperor at age 54. He'd spent decades dreading this moment. And it shows. Pause. Ancient historians describe Tiberius as competent but miserable. He handled the empire's finances brilliantly. In fact, he left Rome richer than he found it. He was militarily strategic, diplomatically shrewd, and administratively gifted. But he hated the performance of power. He hated the Senate's flattery. He hated the public ceremonies. He hated pretending to be a god when he just wanted to read philosophy books. For 13 years, Tiberius endured this existence. He ruled from Rome, attending Senate meetings, receiving foreign dignitaries, playing the role of emperor while dying inside. Then, in 26 AD, something snapped. Mini cliffhanger. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because what happened next, Tiberius's retreat to Capri, has been twisted by history into something far more sinister than it may have actually been. Stay with me, because we're about to separate fact from 2,000-year-old gossip. In 26 AD, Emperor Tiberius made an announcement that stunned the Roman world. He was leaving Rome, not temporarily, permanently. He would govern the empire from the small island of Capri, just off the Bay of Naples. Picture the scene, the most powerful man on earth, abandoning the center of civilization for a rocky island barely 12 miles long. No emperor had ever done this before. It was unprecedented. It was shocking. It was also, quite possibly, the most human thing Tiberius ever did. Pause. Capri in the 1st century AD was paradise. Crystal clear waters, dramatic cliffs, lush vegetation, and, most importantly for Tiberius, isolation. The island had 12 villas, each more luxurious than the last. But it wasn't the luxury that attracted Tiberius. It was the silence. For the first time in decades, Tiberius could wake up without facing a room full of senators pretending to worship him. He could eat breakfast without someone begging for a favor. He could read, think, and simply exist without the crushing weight of imperial performance. But Rome? Rome was horrified. The Senate didn't know how to function without the emperor physically present. Foreign ambassadors had to make the journey to Capri if Tiberius even agreed to see them. Most crucially, the Roman people began to whisper, Why had their emperor abandoned them? What was he doing on that island? Dramatic pause. Human nature abhors a vacuum, especially an information vacuum, and when people don't know the truth, they create their own version of it. The whispers started small. Maybe Tiberius was sick. Maybe he was planning military campaigns. Maybe he was studying astrology. Romans were obsessed with astrology. But whispers have a way of growing, and in Rome, where political reputation could mean the difference between life and death, those whispers quickly became weapons. Mini cliffhanger. Because here's what most people don't realize about ancient Rome. It was a society built on rumor, gossip, and political assassination by reputation. And Tiberius, isolated on his island paradise, had just made himself the perfect target. This is where our story takes a dark turn, not because of what Tiberius actually did on Capri, but because of what people said he did. Within months of Tiberius's departure, the gossip network of Rome was working overtime, and the stories, they were getting progressively more disturbing. First came the relatively innocent rumors. Tiberius was drinking too much wine. He was neglecting state business. He was having affairs with inappropriate women. Standard emperor gossip, really, the kind of thing Romans expected from their rulers. But then the stories escalate. Pause. Suddenly, whispers spoke of orgies, of violence, of acts so depraved that even seasoned Roman politicians, who had seen everything, claimed to be shocked. The island of Capri, once seen as a peaceful retreat, was now being described as a den of unspeakable horrors. But here's the crucial question. Where were these stories coming from? Dramatic pause. The answer reveals something chilling about human nature and political power. These weren't eyewitness accounts from Capri. The island was heavily guarded, and very few people had access to Tiberius. These were stories being manufactured in Rome by people who had never set foot on Capri. Why? Because Tiberius's absence created a power vacuum, and power vacuums don't stay empty for long. Pause. In Rome, a man named Sejanus had been steadily accumulating influence. As Praetorian prefect, essentially the head of the imperial guard, Sejanus controlled access to Tiberius. Every message to the emperor went through Sejanus. Every imperial decision was filtered through Sejanus, and Sejanus was ambitious, dangerously ambitious. Mini cliffhanger. But Sejanus had a problem. As long as Tiberius remained respected and loved by the Roman people, Sejanus's power had limits. But if Tiberius's reputation could be destroyed, if the emperor could be painted as a monster, well, that changed everything. Stay with me, because we're about to see how character assassination works on an imperial scale. What happened next is a masterclass in ancient propaganda, and it's terrifyingly similar to what we see in modern politics. Sejanus didn't need to prove that Tiberius was committing horrific acts on Capri. He just needed people to believe it was possible. And in a society where information traveled slowly and verification was nearly impossible, possibility became reality remarkably quickly. The rumors followed a predictable pattern. They started with elements of truth. Tiberius really was on Capri. He really was isolated. He really wasn't showing his face in Rome. Then they added plausible speculation. Maybe he was ashamed of something. Maybe he was hiding something. Finally, they leaped to sensational fiction. And this is where the stories we know today were born. Pause. According to the gossip circulating in Rome, Tiberius had transformed Capri into his personal playground of depravity. The stories were specific, graphic, and impossible to verify. Perfect ingredients for viral misinformation in the ancient world. But here's what's truly chilling. The people spreading these rumors knew they were likely false. This wasn't honest mistake or misunderstanding. This was deliberate character assassination, designed to serve political purposes. Dramatic pause. And it worked. By 29 AD, Tiberius's reputation in Rome was in ruins. The man who had competently managed the empire for over a decade was now seen as a monster hiding on an island. The Senate whispered about finding a replacement. The people longed for anyone else. Sejanus, meanwhile, continued to consolidate power. He controlled all communication between Rome and Capri. He decided which letters reached Tiberius and which imperial decisions were announced to the public. He was, in everything but name, ruling the Roman Empire. Mini cliffhanger. But Sejanus made one critical mistake. He underestimated Tiberius, because while the emperor may have been isolated on Capri, he wasn't stupid, and he was about to remind Rome exactly how dangerous it was to cross a Caesar. Section 5. The Emperor Strikes Back, 1330 to 1700. October 18th, 31 AD, a date that would go down as one of the most shocking in Roman history. On this day, Emperor Tiberius, still on Capri, still supposedly lost in depraved pleasures, sent a letter to the Roman Senate. The senators gathered eagerly, expecting routine imperial business. Instead, they heard something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The letter began normally. Tiberius discussed grain supplies, tax policies, routine administrative matters. The senators grew bored. Some probably started whispering among themselves. Then came the bombshell. Dramatic pause. In the middle of what seemed like a boring administrative update, Tiberius suddenly pivoted. He began listing crimes, treason, conspiracy, sedition. The senators looked at each other nervously. Who was the emperor talking about? Then came the name that made the blood freeze in their veins. Sejanus. Pause. Picture the scene. The most powerful man in Rome after the emperor himself, the man who controlled access to Tiberius, the man who many believed was the real ruler of the empire. He was being accused of treason by an emperor supposedly too debauched to pay attention to politics. The letter didn't just accuse Sejanus, it systematically dismantled his entire power network, naming co-conspirators, revealing secret communications, exposing a conspiracy that had been years in the making. Tiberius hadn't been distracted by pleasure on Capri. He'd been watching, waiting, planning. The reaction was swift and brutal. Pause. Sejanus was arrested on the spot. By sunset, he was dead. His family members were hunted down and executed. His supporters were purged from the government. His name was literally chiseled off public monuments. But here's the truly chilling part. This wasn't just political housecleaning. This was a message. Tiberius was reminding Rome that reports of his mental absence had been greatly exaggerated. Mini cliffhanger. But the damage to his reputation had already been done. The stories about Capri had spread too far, lasted too long, and taken on a life of their own. Even with Sejanus dead, the monster narrative persisted. In fact, it got worse. After Sejanus's execution, something fundamental changed in Tiberius. The man who had always been reluctant to use imperial power suddenly became ruthless in wielding it. The executions didn't stop with Sejanus. Anyone connected to the conspiracy, real or imagined, found themselves facing treason charges. The emperor, who had once been praised for his restraint, now seemed to see enemies everywhere. But was this the behavior of a man driven mad by absolute power and sexual depravity? Or was it the response of someone who had been systematically betrayed and character assassinated for years? Pause. Here's what we know for certain. Tiberius remained on Capri for the rest of his life, but his governance didn't collapse. He continued to manage imperial finances effectively. He handled military campaigns competently. He maintained diplomatic relationships successfully. These aren't the actions of someone lost in debauchery. These are the actions of someone who had simply decided that physical presence in Rome was unnecessary and potentially dangerous. Dramatic pause. But Rome needed a different narrative. The city that prided itself on civilization and order couldn't admit that their system had nearly been overthrown by a conspiracy, while their competent emperor was simply trying to find some peace on an island. So the stories continued, and they grew more elaborate. Pause. This is where most of the salacious details we associate with Tiberius and Capri actually originated, not from his early years on the island, but from the period after Sejanus's death, when Roman historians needed to explain why their emperor had become so paranoid and ruthless. The narrative was simple. Absolute power and unlimited pleasure had corrupted him completely. The violence, the executions, the paranoia, these weren't the result of political betrayal. They were the inevitable result of moral degradation. It was a story that Romans could understand. It was a story that preserved their faith in their system, and it was a story that absolved everyone of responsibility for what had really happened. Mini cliffhanger. But stories, even convenient ones, have a way of outlasting the people who create them, and the story of Tiberius the monster was about to become immortal. Tiberius died on Capri in 37 AD. He was 77 years old and had ruled for 23 years, longer than most Roman emperors. His death was unremarkable, probably from natural causes, but his legacy, that was just beginning. Pause. Within decades of Tiberius's death, Roman historians began writing his story. And here's where things get really interesting, because these weren't objective scholars trying to understand the past. These were writers with their own political agendas, their own biases, and their own need to explain how Rome had survived what they saw as a dark period. The most influential of these historians was Tacitus, writing almost a century after Tiberius's death. Tacitus was a brilliant writer, but he was also a product of his time, a time when the Julio-Claudian dynasty was seen as corrupt and dangerous. Dramatic pause. Tacitus had access to official records, senatorial archives, and eyewitness accounts. He could have written a nuanced portrait of a complex man in an impossible situation. Instead, he chose to lean into the monster narrative. Why? Because it served a purpose. Tacitus was writing during the reign of Trajan and Hadrian, emperors who were trying to restore dignity and competence to imperial rule. What better way to make them look good than to paint their predecessors as debauched tyrants? Pause. But here's what's crucial to understand. Even Tacitus, when you read him carefully, provides very little concrete evidence for the most outrageous claims about Capri. His accounts are full of phrases like, "it was said that," and "rumors suggested," and "witnesses claimed." He's reporting gossip, not facts, but he's reporting it so skillfully, so dramatically, that it reads like established truth. Pause. Other historians followed Tacitus's lead. Suetonius, writing around the same time, was even more sensational in his descriptions of Tiberius's alleged depravities. But again, when you examine his sources, you find rumors, gossip, and political propaganda, not eyewitness testimony from people who had actually been on Capri. Mini cliffhanger. The pattern becomes clear. The more time passed, the more elaborate the stories became. Each generation of historians added new details, new horrors, new proof of Tiberius's moral corruption. But none of them were getting closer to the truth. They were moving further away from it. Fast forward 2,000 years. Modern historians, armed with archaeological evidence, comparative analysis, and a better understanding of Roman political propaganda, have begun to reassess the story of Tiberius and Capri, and their conclusions are startling. Pause. Archaeological excavations on Capri have revealed the remains of Tiberius's villas. They're impressive, certainly, worthy of an emperor, but they're not the elaborate pleasure palaces described by ancient historians. They're well-designed administrative centers with beautiful views and comfortable living quarters. More importantly, they show evidence of being working government buildings, archives rooms, meeting spaces, courier stations, all the infrastructure you'd need to run an empire remotely. Dramatic pause. Modern historical analysis has also revealed something crucial about the sources for the Capri stories. Almost all of them trace back to the period of Sejanus's conspiracy, when spreading rumors about Tiberius served clear political purposes. Meanwhile, contemporary records from Tiberius's actual reign, tax documents, military dispatches, diplomatic correspondence show an empire being governed competently and effectively throughout his time on Capri. Pause. So what's the modern verdict on Tiberius? Most serious historians now believe he was neither a saint nor a monster. He was a competent but reluctant ruler who made a reasonable decision to govern from a location where he could work effectively without the constant stress of Roman political theater. The stories about depravity and violence? Likely exaggerated at minimum, and quite possibly fabricated entirely. Mini cliffhanger. But here's what's truly chilling about this story. It shows how easily historical truth can be buried under layers of political propaganda and sensational storytelling. If this could happen to a Roman emperor, one of the most documented figures in ancient history, imagine how many other historical truths might actually be lies. As we wrap up this story, I want you to think about something disturbing. The techniques used to destroy Tiberius's reputation 2,000 years ago, rumor-mongering, character assassination, the deliberate spread of unverifiable but sensational claims sound remarkably familiar, don't they? Pause. In our age of social media and instant communication, we like to think we're more sophisticated than ancient Romans. But are we? We still spread unverified stories about public figures. We still believe sensational claims without demanding proof. We still allow political agendas to shape how we understand the truth. The story of Tiberius and Capri is a reminder that human nature hasn't changed much in 2 millennia. We're still capable of creating monsters out of complex people. We're still willing to believe convenient lies over inconvenient truths. Dramatic pause. But there's also a hopeful lesson here. The truth has a way of eventually emerging. It took 2,000 years, but modern scholarship has begun to rehabilitate Tiberius's reputation. The archaeological evidence, the careful analysis of sources, the willingness to question long-held assumptions, these things matter. Pause. Maybe that's the most important lesson from Capri. We have a responsibility to seek truth, even when lies are more entertaining. We have an obligation to question narratives, especially when they serve someone's political agenda. And we have a duty to remember that behind every historical monster, there was once a human being whose story deserves to be told accurately. Mini cliffhanger. Because if we don't learn these lessons, we're doomed to keep repeating the same patterns, and the next person to be destroyed by rumor and innuendo might be someone we actually know. So what really happened on Capri between 27 and 37 AD? The most likely truth is surprisingly mundane. A tired, aging emperor found a beautiful place where he could do his job without the constant stress and political theater of Rome. He governed effectively from his island retreat, while his enemies spread increasingly wild stories about what he must be doing in private. It's not as exciting as tales of debauchery and violence, but it's probably true. Pause. The real tragedy isn't what Tiberius allegedly did on Capri. It's what we lost when we chose sensational fiction over historical truth. We lost the story of a complex man navigating an impossible job. We lost lessons about leadership, isolation, and the burden of power. We lost the opportunity to understand how political propaganda works and why we should be skeptical of it. Instead, we got a monster story that survived for 2,000 years. Final pause. But maybe it's not too late to reclaim the truth. Maybe we can learn Tao Tse. Be more careful about the stories we believe and the narratives we perpetuate. Maybe we can remember that history is written by people with agendas, and those agendas don't always serve truth. Soft CTA. If this story made you think differently about how we understand history, or how we evaluate the stories we hear about public figures today, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed diving deep into the complex truth behind historical legends, make sure to subscribe. We explore these kinds of stories every week, always searching for the human truth behind the myths. Thanks for staying with me on this journey to ancient Capri. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you hear, especially the ones that seem too shocking to be true.